There is a piece of paper that is supposed to end things. It carries signatures, a judge's stamp, a case number, a date. In the eyes of the law, the matter is resolved. Two people who were once legally one become legally two again. Whatever happened between them, the love, the arguments, the promises, the disappointments, the shared history of ordinary days, has been formally concluded. At least, that is what most people tell themselves when the process finally ends. The clean break, the fresh start, the closing of a door that should have been closed sooner, and now, finally, is. But families are not resolved by legal documents. And the story that begins the day those papers are signed is often longer, quieter, and more complicated than anyone who has never lived through it can quite imagine. Divorce is one of those subjects that modern life has made easier to discuss in general terms but harder to address honestly in particular ones. We have moved away from treating it as a moral failure, which was a compassionate and long overdue change. Too many people stayed in marriages that were damaging, even dangerous, for too many years because the cultural shame of leaving felt worse than the private cost of staying. The shift away from that shame was real progress. But in making divorce more socially acceptable, we may also have made it harder to acknowledge what divorce actually costs. Not in theory, not in aggregate statistics about well-being outcomes, but in the quiet accounting of real lives, in the financial records, the family calendars, the bedrooms that went from 2 children to 1, the grandparents who now need to schedule visits to see grandchildren they used to see every Sunday, the person who goes home to a different house and sits down in front of a dinner plate that was once one of 4. The clean break, it turns out, is a useful legal concept and a fairly rare human experience. What does divorce actually do to a family? Not in the legal sense, not in the abstract sense, but in the long human sense, in the years and decades that follow the signing? That is what we are going to look at today. We are not going to judge people who divorce. Divorce is sometimes the most honest and necessary thing a person can do in an impossible situation. Staying in a marriage that is broken is not automatically noble. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for your children is to stop performing a partnership that has become corrosive, and to begin building something more honest in its place. But the complexity and validity of any individual's reasons for leaving does not change the fact that divorce produces consequences, financial, emotional, relational, and generational, that tend to be underestimated, under-acknowledged, and quietly carried for far longer than anyone planned. Some of you listening to this went through a divorce. You know firsthand what the period after feels like. The paperwork and the silence and the strange disorientation of coming home to a place that still smells like a shared life that no longer exists. Some of you are adult children of divorce, carrying something you absorbed in childhood that you have spent years or decades trying to understand. Some of you watched a sibling, a parent, or a close friend's marriage end, and felt the ripples reach your own life in ways you did not fully anticipate. Some of you are grandparents who are still, quietly, navigating the consequences of something that was never your decision. This episode is for all of you. It is not an argument against divorce. It is not a statement that people should stay in bad marriages. It is something quieter and, I think, more useful than that. It is an honest look at what divorce actually leaves behind, in individual lives, in family structures, in the children who grow up to be adults still sorting through what happened when they were young, in the people who did the divorcing and who have spent years wondering whether they made peace with it too quickly or not quickly enough. Because there is a gap between the conversation our culture tends to have about divorce, which focuses on the decision, the process, the legal resolution, and the experience that comes after, which is longer, less structured, and rarely discussed with anything approaching the same seriousness. The aftermath is real, and it deserves to be understood. To understand what divorce does to a family, it helps to understand how dramatically the place of divorce in Western society has shifted over the last 100 years. For most of human history, across most cultures, marriage was not primarily a romantic arrangement. It was an economic and social contract. It organized property, secured family alliances, structured communities, and provided a stable framework for the raising of children. The feelings of the people inside the marriage were real, but they were not the organizing principle. Whether two people were genuinely happy together was often considered a private matter, secondary to whether the household functioned and the family remained intact. This made divorce rare, not because marriages were happy, many were not, but because the social, financial, and legal barriers were extraordinarily high. In most of the Western world well into the 20th century, women had almost no independent economic standing. Leaving a marriage was not simply a social stigma. For most women, it was a financial catastrophe from which there was no clear recovery. And so people stayed, not always out of love, often out of necessity or fear, or the simple absence of a viable alternative. In the United States, the divorce rate through the early 20th century was relatively low. It rose modestly after World War II, partly because returning soldiers came home changed in ways their families had not been prepared for, partly because women who had worked in factories and offices during the war years had developed a different sense of what they were capable of, and partly because the post-war prosperity gave more families the financial cushion that made separation imaginable. But the real shift came in the 1960s and 1970s, and it was substantial. No-fault divorce laws changed the legal landscape in a fundamental way. Before these reforms, a divorce typically required proof of wrongdoing: adultery, abandonment, cruelty. One party had to be at fault. This created a system in which people seeking divorce were forced either to fabricate a narrative of wrongdoing or to remain legally bound in marriages they could not sustain. After the no-fault reforms, which swept through most American states during the 1970s, either partner could simply declare that the marriage had irretrievably broken down, and that declaration was legally sufficient. The barrier dropped to almost nothing. Cultural attitudes shifted alongside the law. The second wave of feminism gave many women both the language and the social permission to acknowledge that an unhappy marriage was not something they were morally obligated to endure for the rest of their lives. The idea that personal fulfillment was a legitimate goal, not a selfish one, took hold in ways that had not been possible in previous generations. Staying became a choice, not a requirement. And for many people, that shift was genuinely liberating. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, the divorce rate in the United States had roughly doubled compared to what it had been 2 decades earlier. It peaked around 1980 and has gradually declined since, partly because marriage itself has become less common, and partly because the people who do marry tend to do so later, with more deliberation and more financial independence already established. But for the generation that grew up in the 1970s and 1980s, divorce was not a cultural statistic. It was something that happened to their own parents, their neighbors, their friends' families. It was the reorganizing force of childhood for millions of people who are now in their 40s, 50s, and 60s. People who absorbed the experience at an age when they had very little context for understanding it, and who are still, in some cases, working through what it meant. And for the generation that did the divorcing, people who separated in their 30s and 40s, who told themselves and their children they were starting over, that everyone would be better off, the long aftermath was something they had no roadmap for. The legal permission to leave was new. The cultural language of personal liberation was new. But the emotional, financial, and relational map of what came after had not yet been drawn. Society had revised the entrance and the exit of marriage. It had done much less work on everything that happened in the years that followed the exit. No one had really worked out how to be a family across 2 households. How to share custody without using the children as emotional couriers. How to explain to a 9-year-old why Thanksgiving now happened twice, in 2 different places, with 2 different groups of people trying hard to seem relaxed. How to handle the school play, the graduation, the wedding, when the 2 people who were supposed to sit together in the front row could not be in the same room without something going wrong. No one had worked out what happened when one of those parents remarried, bringing a new partner and possibly new children into a family structure that was already fragile and still in the process of reorganizing. Or what happened when the money ran out, because it often did, because splitting one household into two on the same income is arithmetic that tends not to work in anyone's favor, no matter how carefully the lawyers divide the assets. Society made divorce easier to do. The harder part, everything that came after, remained largely uncharted. The most visible cost of divorce is the one carried by the couple themselves. The loneliness of living alone after years of shared life. The financial shock of dividing a household. The grief, sometimes unacknowledged even to themselves, of a shared future that will not happen now. The disorientation of going from a person with a partner to a person without one, in a world that is still mostly organized around the assumption of two. These costs are real and they are significant, but they tend to receive most of the cultural attention. And as a result, the costs that fall on everyone else in the family, the children, the grandparents, the extended family, the friends who loved both people and now feel they have to choose, often go understated or overlooked entirely. Start with the children. There is now a substantial body of research on the long-term effects of parental divorce on children, and the picture is genuinely more nuanced than the simple versions. Divorce always damages children. On one side, children are resilient and adapt, on the other. The reality sits somewhere more complicated, shaped by factors that include the level of conflict in the marriage before the divorce, the level of conflict during and after, the financial stability of both households in the years that follow, and the quality of the parenting from both sides through the transition and beyond. What the research consistently shows, though, is that the effects do not end in childhood. Adult children of divorce, people who were 8 or 12 or 15 when their parents' marriage ended, and who are now in their 40s or 50s, carry things that can take decades to surface clearly. A lower baseline trust in the durability of relationships. A particular kind of anxiety around commitment, either avoiding it or clinging to it so tightly that the clinging itself creates problems. A tendency to notice early signs of conflict in their own relationships with a vigilance that is, in some ways, a skill, and in other ways, an exhausting habit inherited from a childhood that required it. Many people do not think of themselves as carrying something from their parents' divorce. They have been adults for 30 years. They have built their own lives, had their own relationships, raised their own children. But they may notice certain patterns without fully understanding where they came from. A difficulty trusting that security is real rather than temporary. A particular kind of discomfort around conflict that goes deeper than most situations seem to warrant. A way of managing love that involves keeping some part of themselves slightly held back, just in case. Not as a deliberate strategy, but as a posture that settled in early and never quite left. These patterns do not mean anyone's life has been destroyed by something that happened when they were a child. They mean they are human, and that formative experiences leave marks, the way almost all formative experiences do. The question is whether those marks ever get examined clearly enough to be understood and, over time, moved through. Then there is the financial aftermath, a cost that receives surprisingly little honest public attention, given how significant it tends to be. When a household divides, the economics do not simply split evenly. They deteriorate. Two people who were combining incomes to cover a mortgage, utilities, food, insurance, and the ordinary expenses of maintaining a home now need to cover the same basic costs twice, on the same total income. For many couples, particularly those with children still at home, this means both parties end up at a significantly reduced standard of living, at least for some years. For the lower-earning partner, particularly one who stepped out of the workforce to raise children, or who sacrificed career advancement for the sake of the family's daily logistics, the financial damage can be severe and lasting in ways that compound quietly over time. Fewer years of retirement contributions, reduced social security benefits based on lower lifetime earnings, less cushion to absorb unexpected expenses without falling into debt. The financial reality of divorce is one of the reasons why the romantic narrative of the fresh start so often collides with a considerably less romantic practical reality. Starting over is expensive, and the people who pay the highest price are not always the ones who made the decision. Beyond the couple and their children, divorce radiates outward through the extended family in ways that are rarely fully counted. Grandparents who had close, daily relationships with grandchildren may find that access suddenly depends entirely on the state of a relationship between two adults they have no control over. A grandmother who was a central presence in a grandchild's life, school pickups, weekend visits, the person the child called when they needed something, may find herself now seeing that child on alternating holidays, subject to scheduling decisions made between two adults who are no longer speaking kindly to each other. She did not cause the divorce. She did not choose it. But she lives with its consequences every time a birthday or a Christmas requires advanced negotiation. For many grandparents, this loss, which is real and significant, goes largely unacknowledged because the cultural conversation is focused elsewhere, on the couple and their children, while the grandparents are expected to simply adjust. The broader family network adjusts too. Siblings, cousins, aunts and uncles, old friends who knew both people for years, all of them find themselves navigating a landscape where old affiliations have become complicated. Being warm to one person is sometimes read as a betrayal by the other. Family gatherings that once felt uncomplicated now require careful planning and quiet management. The people caught in this reorganization often do not feel entitled to say how hard it is. It is not their divorce. They are expected to be supportive and neutral and available. And they try, but they absorb costs too. And those costs tend not to appear in any accounting of what divorce does to a family. We tend to talk about divorce as a decision made by two people. And legally, it is. But the more time passes, the more it becomes clear that divorce is better understood as an event in the life of a family. One that the entire family then has to metabolize, over years and sometimes over generations. A family does not end with divorce. It transforms. The relationships reorganize around a new reality. Parents become former spouses. A household becomes two households. Children move between them, carrying their bags and their slowly adapting sense of what home means. Grandparents learn new protocols. Step-parents arrive, bringing their own histories and expectations. Step-siblings appear, strangers expected to share a space and become something like family. The family continues, but it continues differently, in a new shape that takes time for everyone inside it to learn to inhabit without constantly bumping against its edges. What makes this particularly difficult is that divorce requires a kind of emotional labor that is very different from what other family losses demand. When a family member dies, the loss tends to bring people together. There are rituals. There are established roles. The community shows up, acknowledges what happened, and provides a structure for grieving. When a family faces illness or financial hardship, the usual response is solidarity. People gather, they help, they hold things together. Divorce divides. It creates competing loyalties where solidarity once lived. It removes the shared framework that gave the family its shape and then asks everyone to keep functioning without it. And unlike death, it offers no socially established period of mourning, no ritual acknowledgement of what has been lost. People are expected to move forward, to be practical, to be civil. To divide the furniture and update the paperwork and smile appropriately at the children's school events. But grief is grief. And what many people experience in the aftermath of a divorce, whether they are the couple themselves, or the children, or the grandparents, or the extended family, is a grief that does not always get called by its name. There is the grief of the future that was imagined and will not happen. The retirement that was planned as a partnership. The grandchildren who were going to be raised with two grandparents in the same home. The old age that was going to be shared, difficult in parts, probably, but shared. These futures were not fantasies. They were reasonable expectations built on real commitments. Their loss deserves to be mourned honestly. There is also the grief of what genuinely existed. Even in marriages that ended badly, there were good years, sometimes many of them. Real partnership, real intimacy, real history accumulated across decades of ordinary life. Moments of joy that belonged to both people and that, after the separation, become complicated to remember. The trip they took years ago. The years when the children were small and exhausting and wonderful. The hard period they got through together, the one that made them feel, briefly, like nothing could break them. Those things were real. Losing access to them, losing the person who shared them, is a real loss, even when the relationship needed to end, even when leaving was right. For children, there is a particular kind of grief that can be the hardest to name. The grief of a family they believed in, that turned out to be more fragile than they understood. This is not melodrama. It is a genuine disruption in how a child organizes their experience of the world. Children understand themselves partly through the family they belong to, through its permanence, its predictability, its daily presence. When that family reorganizes, something in their sense of what is solid and permanent reorganizes with it. The recovery from that is possible. Millions of people make it, fully and genuinely. But it is not automatic, and it is rarely as quick as the adults involved tend to hope or assume. What divorce also leaves behind is a changed relationship to commitment itself. Not necessarily a worse one. Sometimes it becomes more deliberate, more honest about what love actually requires across the long arc of a life together. But different in a way that is permanent. The person who has been through a divorce, or who grew up watching one, carries a knowledge that the person who has not cannot easily access from the outside. That the most sincerely meant promises can fail to hold. That love is not permanent by nature. That the person you intended to grow old beside can become, over time and through accumulating damage, a stranger. Or something more painful than a stranger, because there is still memory attached to them. This knowledge changes people. It makes some more cautious, more protective of the interior life they have learned can be hurt. It makes others more deliberate, choosing their relationships with more care and more clarity because they understand more fully what is at stake. And it makes some people harder, more defended, less willing to risk the particular vulnerability that deep love requires, in ways they are not always aware of until someone tries to get close to them and finds something holding them back. Then there is the question of patterns and how they travel forward through time. The patterns that form in the wake of a family divorce, in the adults who went through it and in the children who witnessed it, have a way of persisting into the next generation. Not because families are fated to repeat themselves. That is too simple and too bleak, but because the patterns we learn in our earliest and most formative relationships tend to be the ones that feel most natural, even when we know they are not serving us well. The child who learned that love ends is likely to prepare, on some level, for it to end again. The person who stayed too long in a bad marriage may find themselves accepting things in a subsequent relationship that they once would not have considered acceptable, not because they have given up, but because their threshold for what is tolerable was recalibrated by years of enduring what should have ended sooner. To recognize this is not to assign blame. It is not to say that people are trapped by their history, because they are not. It is to take seriously the idea that understanding the patterns is the first step toward being able to make different choices, that what was transmitted can also be examined, and that the marks left by a family rupture are not invisible, once a person learns where to look. There is no version of this conversation that resolves the problem neatly. Divorce is real. The long aftermath is real. The costs distributed through families across years and generations are real. And there is no formula that makes those costs disappear or that transforms them, in retrospect, into something other than what they were. And yet, families find ways through it. Not always cleanly, not always fully, not without carrying something for the rest of their lives. But they find ways through. Adult children of divorce build stable, loving marriages of their own, sometimes precisely because they saw what happens when things go wrong and decided, quietly and deliberately, that they would do things differently. People who lost financial stability in the aftermath of a split rebuild slowly, sometimes over a very long time, and arrive somewhere they genuinely did not expect. Grandparents who feared losing access to grandchildren sometimes find that the relationship, in its new form, deepens in ways that proximity alone never demanded. That having to be more intentional about time together made the time itself more present, more alive. Former spouses who were certain they could never manage to be civil sometimes find, over years, a quiet functional cooperation that serves the children well enough, long enough, that it becomes something recognizable as peace. None of this erases what it cost. None of it makes the difficult years retroactively simple. But it does mean that cost is not the final word. What seems to help, in the long run, is a particular kind of honesty, not the kind that requires everyone to relitigate the past at every family gathering, but the quieter kind that simply acknowledges, this happened, it was hard, it left marks on all of us, and we are still a family. Just a different shape of one than we expected to be. For adult children still working through what their parents' divorce meant, even decades later, even when life is otherwise full and good, the most useful thing is often something very simple: permission. Permission to have been affected by something that happened when you were young. Permission to grieve something the adults in your life may have minimized or dismissed because they were too consumed by their own pain to attend to what you were absorbing. Permission to notice the patterns that formed without being defined by them. Permission to say that something was difficult, even if the divorce was ultimately the right decision and even if everyone involved is, more or less, fine now. Because things being fine now does not mean the hard years were not hard. Both can be true at once. That is one of the quieter things that time tends to teach, if we let it. For the people who went through the divorce themselves, the question that tends to linger longest is not always whether the decision was right. Many people have found some kind of peace with that. But whether the person they were before, the person who made promises and tried and built something and then watched it come apart, is someone they can still regard with some compassion. And for most people who are willing to look honestly, the answer is yes. They did what they could with what they understood at the time. They were not perfect. Probably they made mistakes, before, during, and after. But they tried, and that deserves to be acknowledged, quietly, without either false pride or excessive guilt. For the extended family, for the grandparents and siblings and cousins and old friends caught in someone else's reorganization, the task is one of the genuinely harder ones. To remain present without becoming a casualty of a conflict that was never really yours. To hold love for multiple people at the same time, even when those people can no longer hold love for each other. To find ways of staying connected to the children and grandchildren without becoming an instrument of someone's grievance. It is not simple. It requires a kind of discipline that is easy to admire and harder to practice. But the people who manage it, the ones who decide early that the children's needs matter more than their own need to take aside, often become, in the long run, one of the most stabilizing forces in a family that is still finding its new shape. A family does not end with divorce. It becomes something else, and that something else is uncertain and difficult to inhabit, especially at first. Sometimes it becomes worse than what it replaced, more fragmented, more quietly painful, organized around an absence that nobody fully names. Sometimes, honestly, it becomes better, more truthful, less held together by pretense, more able to give people what they actually need rather than what the old form required everyone to perform. Usually, it becomes more complicated than either of those simple descriptions. More human, but it continues. And perhaps that is the thing most worth holding onto. Not that divorce is without cost. Not that everyone gets through it gracefully or fully or without leaving something important behind. But that families, even reorganized ones, even ones that barely speak anymore, even ones still carrying the weight of a rupture from 30 years ago, are more durable than they appear in the worst moments. The papers that were supposed to end things rarely end everything. And that is painful, but it is also, in its own quiet way, a reason for something like hope. Because something survives, something continues, something is still, in some imperfect and complicated way, possible. And whether any of the people involved choose to reach for it is still, in most cases, a choice that remains open.